Let's get into another book on the philosophy of fascism, and this is entitled The Philosophy of Fascism by Mario Palomari. We'll break this book down in 3 separate videos. This will be the first of the 3 installments. And he'll deal with the first part of his book entitled Fascism as a Way of Life. One indivisible tie binds together the destinies of all men. There cannot be any joy or any pain experienced by one single individual, any good or any evil befallen him, which shall not ultimately affect the welfare of the race, the progress of the world, and the very course of history. As the fall of stone in a quiet pool draws at the surface of the water concentric circles which grow always wider in diameter until they extend to the extreme limits of the pool, thus the consequences of a human deed which seemed at first to affect the life of one man grow little by little to affect the lives of all men. So whether it's acknowledged or not, if you live in a community of people, an individual's actions, especially negative actions, affect much more than just themselves. No other period of human history is deemed, in fact, to be more unique, more brilliant than the period of the Renaissance. If ever man seemed to have found the true measure of his powers, it was then, when life was all one glory of artistic expression. But the Renaissance sang not only in the paean of art, it sang also the birth of individualism. The philosophy of life, which was to guide through the following centuries the thoughts and actions of men towards the present state of chaos and despair. The invisible and imponderable forces which molded the aspects assumed by the various manifestations of life of modern times were indeed born with the Renaissance. And the historian who attempts to portray the debacle of individualism and the rise of fascism must go back in time to discover the roots of this phenomenon within the fertile soil of ideas, theories, systems, etc., characterizing those eventful years. The Renaissance has importance. Instead, inasmuch as it represents the birth of individualism, the birth of a philosophy of life which was to hold sway over the thoughts and actions of men for well nigh 4 centuries. Those momentous centuries characterized by the greatest changes in all fields of human activity. The birth of individualism meant belief in man and his powers, hence the Reformation, which, relying especially on man's reasoning power, transformed this belief into practical and, in a way, logical actuation with the doctrine of freedom from all authoritative rules of faith. The birth of individualism meant also the birth of freedom from all external authority, all external constraint, all external rules and laws, hence liberalism, which, forgetting that man is truly a man only because he is a part of a greater whole, proclaimed the doctrine of liberty, which is at the bottom only a doctrine of negative liberty. The birth of individualism meant, in short, the decay of all ties which connect man to the spiritual world and make of him a being thoroughly distinct from the world of nature. So the third position thought is individualism, extreme individualism. Of course, there's always an individualism within everyone, and there's always individualism encouraged as far as expression, creativity, etc. How man has created and invented, manifested thought into reality. But when the overall dogma of the society, of the New Age preachers, of democracy, of liberalism, of capitalism, is the individual above all, that severs the root of the individual from the collective, from his people, from his tribe, from his ethnicity, from his race, from his nation, etc. What is individualism then? Individualism is the negation of the fundamental unity which is at the root of being and which underlies the whole world of man. Is the negation of the principle of authority which reattaches through intermediate stages the fleeting individual to the eternal source of justice and power. Is the truly worthy of its name when it releases man of the tyranny of his needs, his desires, and his wants, and makes him choose of his own free will what is of higher value than the satisfaction of senses. Is the negation of the principle of duty, which is in the foundation of all the moral world, and the affirmation in its stead of the principle of rights. Those rights which are the perennial spring of all human ills and evils. Is the negation of the spiritual essence of man and the affirmation that what is paramount for man is his material, economic, or bodily well-being, and that his welfare is worth any other being's suffering, disgrace, or death. Is the glorification of each individual as a center and lord of the whole universe and the apotheosis consequently of his individual needs, passions, and desires. Is finally the triumph of all reasoning faculties of the mind over the mystic powers of the soul. So when you're separated from the root, when you're separated from your people, from your nation, you are void of a greater cause outside of your own immediate gratification. This is what Palamari is saying. But when you are part of the whole, under third position philosophy, there is a greater goal. There is the direction of humanity. There is a cohesiveness of citizen amongst each other. Jobs are not worked simply to make money, to pay rent, and to buy shit. But jobs are worked because they are contributing to the direction and the progress of the society and mankind itself. Third position philosophy is the philosophy of saying a united man with a direction can accomplish anything. But individualism and democracy and capitalism is tyranny of the lower instincts of man. Palamari goes on. It is thus that, guided by the tenets of such a fatal philosophy of life, man was no longer concerned with the great beyond, with the ideals of ethics, with the triumph of law and justice, with the dream of salvation, with visions of great feats of the spirit. With the advent of modern times, man became primarily and above all concerned with his own welfare. And since belief in the soul was finally destroyed by the misinterpreted findings of science, this welfare meant in the end only and simply the welfare of his own body. The search for a meaning of life ended at the same time with the discovery that the individual is the center of the whole universe, and that this universe is nothing more than a playfield ready at hand for the expression of his personality. Individualism, asserting itself and triumphing thus every other conception of life, gradually led mankind through democratic government, competitive business, acquisition property, heredity wealth, economic individual welfare, social class struggle, and national wars, to a state of things of which it is already possible to visualize the outcome. That outcome prophesied so clearly and forcefully by Oswald Spengler in Decline of the West. The Renaissance had its day of glory, and then, as all mortal things, it became a thing of the past. But man, drunk with his newly discovered freedom, driven onward by his instincts and his psychological needs, carried on the daily business of living more and more relentlessly, ruthlessly, trampling over bodies and souls of his less endowed, less powerful fellow beings. The question must be raised then, and it is supremely timely that it be raised now. And this was in 1936 when he wrote this book, so it's paramount they raised it then, but here we are still now raising the same question. The question must be raised then, whether individualism represents the true answer to the quest of man for the right philosophy of life. It is the very nature of man, in fact, that he cannot remain long satisfied with the assumption that the life of his spirit is ended with a concern for the individual's bodily welfare, and that for him there is nothing else left than to eat and drink and beget other children, who in turn shall eat and drink and have children, so that the repetition of this seemingly perpetual cycle, birth, life, death, rebirth, may never come to an end. And maybe this is a part of our idealism as third position philosophy believers, but there's always the belief, as there is in me, as there was in Palomari close to 100 years ago, that materialism cannot fill the hole in people's soul for long enough to continue enough for a long time. And as the saying goes, man cannot live off bread and water alone. And this is the belief of the fascist. We must have a direction. We must have a goal. Man is meant to improve, to excel, to explore, to discover, to conquer, and to continue on. Such a system can only stress the claims of the individual to complete self-expression and make of these claims the highest goal and the true end of life. But the claims of one individual must need conflict with the claims of another. The life of one being must need be at war with the life of the whole if those claims are to be a triumph. An effort must be made to break the invisible tie which binds together the destinies of all men. If the life of the one be set against the life of another, a whole endless series of evils arises. In short, whenever and wherever individualism triumphs as a philosophy and a way of life. And that's exactly what goes on under capitalism. You are set to compete financially against your neighbor, against your fellow citizen. If you work for a different company that produces the same product, you're working to put your fellow citizen out of business because it directly improves your material life. Under third position philosophy, competition exists, but the competition is not at the expense of putting your fellow citizen out of work, of taking food off the table from children of your own nation. It is thus clearly seen that the conditions which made possible the rise of fascism arose from the basic conception of which the modern life of the Western world is based. These conditions are not peculiar to one nation, but to all nations. In its current materialistic, mechanistic, individualistic conception of life, with its negation of the spiritual essence of man, and with its assumption of a godless universe in which man is subject to only one rule, the rule of his animal nature, that has prepared the soil for the rise of fascism, as it has today, as it did then. It is the apparent debacle of all human efforts for a better life, the apparent impossibility to bring about some form of order out of the present state of chaos and stop the prophesied downfall of Western civilization. It is the realization that man, left free to gratify his lust of power, his greed of gold, his love of the senses, his worship of force, is a pitiful and despicable being. And it is finally the vision that a higher calling must be a true heritage of man. That has brought about the birth of fascism. It is the fact that man has lost faith in himself, the fact that he cannot derive any support from his inner world, and he finds himself compelled to grope for an aid in the outer world. It is the acknowledged fact of his sad moral decadence, in short, that has made possible the triumph of fascism. It is not unusual to hear, in fact, that fascism is merely a change of the social and political system of one nation, or a revolt of the middle class, or a organization of the capitalistic groups, or the domination of a militaristic caste. Also the tool of despotism, the product of reaction, the creature of dictatorship, the instrument of brutal, incontinent violence, and finally, the nemesis of liberty. But all these definitions fail to seize the central truth of fascism. They place in a distorted relief some of the transitory aspects of the phenomenon, but shed no light upon its permanent and universal elements, that is, upon the inner core of fascism, which only has meaning and value for the whole world of men. Fascism is something more, something infinitely greater than a tyrannical dictatorship over the souls and bodies of men, something of deeper import than a new form of economic organization or a mere change of the social and political system of one nation. What is fascism then? Fascism is an immensely idealistic and, more specifically, anti-materialistic and anti-individualistic philosophy of life. Fascism turns toward the individual to tell him, "Thy life has no absolute, no eternal value whatsoever. Thy life can assume worth only in as much as it is devoted and, if necessary, sacrificed to the triumph of an idea. Men live today, die tomorrow, but ideas live forever. And the one who will seek to save his own life shall truly lose it, because only by offering it in a holocaust to the everlasting idea does the individual life partake of the character of immortality." Immortality is obtained in the small part of contributing to that idea and being a small part of that, or to being a large part of that, of being an innovator and creator and enhancer within the idea. This meaning of life as a triumph of a remote ideal over the immediate reality of a universal over the individual is a fundamental characteristic of fascism. The conduct of life must rest upon three great unalterable principles. Fascism maintains, namely, the principle of unity, the principle of authority, and the principle of duty. Man does not live by bread alone, but also and mainly of beliefs. Given an inspiring set of beliefs, man may be able to accomplish great deeds, and the world may be vivified by a new age of faith. It is fascism which has brought mankind to face and to acknowledge once more the fundamental fact of life. The fact that, in the words of Carlyle, "But the thing a man does practically lay to heart and know for certain concerning his vital relations to this mysterious universe and his duty and destiny there, that is in all cases the primary thing for him, and creatively determines all the rest." Need of restoring the faith of mankind in a set of beliefs capable to vivify the present unbelieving, unsatisfactory, and aimless life into a new expression of power, of energy, of achievements. That's it. United and towards a common goal, we can achieve anything we desire. And it's so frustrating that we live in a society that encourages us not only to all go our own little separate ways, but to indulge in hedonism, in nihilism, and cosmopolitanism on top of all of that. When they had the concept of unity and specific goals. This is always the most successful way to achieve anything. This is why every business, every sport team, every army is run under the same type of format. Authoritarian, someone at top, setting the direction, setting the course, and unified people working towards that goal. This is why there's no democracy on a football team. This is why there's no parliamentary activity in the war room. It is thus on this account of this recognition of mankind's deepest need of the visual and realization of a better life that fascism deserves to be hailed as the herald of a new age, the age which will witness the triumph of the whole realm of spiritual values over the petty and selfish aims of the individual ego. Man is above, outside, and against nature. Man is a part and product of nature. These two visions of man, like the two poles of being, set in antithesis to each other and separated by an unbridgeable chasm, represent the keys to the right understanding of the two contrasting philosophies of our times, fascist idealism and modern materialism. The moment that we think of man as being gifted with the gifts of the Spirit and therefore endowed with the power of creation, with the ability to transcend the contingencies of his material life, with a desire to rise above determinism of outward events and inward needs, with the aspiration towards a life which is not of this earth but belongs to the magic land of his beliefs and dreams, that moment marks also our entrance into the realm of fascist idealism. Like I've stated before, it is the desire to achieve the fantastical. It is realizing the potential of united man. It is realizing that a life led for material pleasures is a life wasted. The moment instead that we think of man bound to the world of nature, unable to free himself from the shackles and the fetters of his sense experiences, an animal among animals, the only difference between his life and their life being his peculiar subjection to the action of mysterious laws of economics, which can make of the existence of the greater number of his brethren a veritable hell on earth. That moment marks also our acquaintance with materialism, the philosophical doctrine characterizing the way of life of so large a part of the modern world. It is in times like the present, when man's only happiness is found in sensuous enjoyment alone, when man's religious life is become a perfunctory performance of ritualistic and meaningless practices, when the life of the spirit is at its lowest ebb, that there is a high need for a new revival of idealism as a philosophy and a way of life. What shall the aspects of this new idealism be? It cannot eventually be a reaffirmation of the old theories and old principles. Neither can it be an academic discussion of abstract systems of beliefs with no relation to the world of facts, i.e. modern-day liberalism. To be a vital force in the life of modern man, the new idealism must above all deliver a message in tune with the needs of this life as it is being lived today, and not as it ought to be lived in a future which may never dawn. Furthermore, the new idealism must of necessity take into account all the complexity of the modern world. To deny this complexity or to ignore some aspects of this world would spell beforehand the doom of any philosophical doctrine which attempts to interpret or direct the present state of affairs. And this is exactly why fascism is always centered around populism, because it takes into account the world they're in. Once again, to refer to one of my other videos where I say we're dealt a certain hand and we have to play that hand. We can wish we were dealt a different hand, a better hand, all we want, but we're not. We're dealt this hand. and we have to play this hand to the best of our abilities. The new idealism must not remain an intellectual pastime of the elite, but must leaven the life of the masses. It is to the masses and not to the few that the new idealism must bring its message of salvation, and bring it in such a form as to make it easily intelligible and readily accepted. Because salvation is not a privilege of the intellectuals, but a need of the people. That is salvation from what makes the people forgetful of the existence of something higher and nobler than the life of the body, and leads them to exchange for a belief in the abiding reality of things unseen. Their belief in the illusory and deceptive transistorizes of the world of senses. Above all, the message of the new idealism must be a message for the man of today. The man whom we all know, one of us, our brother in spirit if not flesh, with our vices and our virtues, our hopes and our failures, our sorrows and our joys, our aspirations and our dreams. Only in this way can the new idealism conquer a place in our mind and in our heart, change our whole way of life, and thus bring about our own salvation. Such must the distinguishing features of the new idealism be. Such indeed are the distinguishing features of fascist idealism. Striking at the root of the evil which poisons the very springs of his being, fascism tells man that it is high time for him to set himself definitively above, outside, against nature, cutting abruptly the Gordian knot which keeps him a slave of his psychological needs and the material hindrances. Fascism tells man, arise at last, come into thine own reach, the full stature of thy being. Fulfill thy mission in the world, be the master of thine own destiny. And when he talks about overcoming nature, he's essentially talking about overcoming what Freud called the id, overcoming those primal instincts, those same things that the capitalists feed on today, those same things that international finance feeds on today. The fascist way of life is thus, as it ought be lived, a life that is of devotion to those ideals which from the very substance of the world of the spirit, the world of timeless and absolute values, which partakes of the essence of God and to which belongs to the true essence of man. In the fascist way of life, man becomes conscious at last of his sense of responsibility towards his fellow beings, will transform the conception of the brotherhood of all human beings into a fact. The vision of the indissoluble tie which makes of their destinies one interrelated whole into a reality. I bet your public school teacher didn't tell you this was what fascism was. I bet you the History Channel didn't tell you this is what fascism is. They create a false narrative and false reality of fascism because they fear it. They know this ideal can catch on like a wildfire, spreading and engulfing the spirit of the people. There is a question that man has always asked at every crucial time of his history, and that question is, what is the meaning and purpose of this life of mine? Has it a mission to fulfill, a goal to reach, a plan to unfold, or is it simply a tale full of fury, signifying nothing? I wonder how many people actually even have that thought today. Maybe I'm being a bit pessimistic, but I truly wonder that. I think as mankind has degraded, less and less people has asked themselves this and seriously pondered this question. Because if they have, I don't see how this modern lie can continue to go on. Throughout the whole process of history, we assist, in other words, to the unfolding powers and energies within man of almost divine nature, of almost godlike essence. whenever his anxious quest for the meaning of life has led him to visualize and worship a deeper reality lying behind and beyond the intermediate and closely bound world of his own self. But with the advent of modern man, the scene changes. Man is no longer concerned with the ideals of beauty, of law, of authority, is no longer interested in the life beyond, is no longer living for the triumph of the spirit within. With the advent of modern times, man is simply and solely concerned with his own welfare. And since this welfare means only the satisfaction of his bodily needs and desires, a thoroughly materialistic view of life which has no place for the worship of such intangible things as the worship of ideals, triumphs over and against all which had been held great and dignified and worthy in human life. It is thus that modern man, rejecting all other interpretations of the meaning of life as expressions of a dead and soon forgotten past, maintains that it is highly doubtful whether life has meaning at all, and that, at best, this meaning consists only of the fullest realization of one's own possibilities, and that the goal of life is to bring about such a realization here on this earth and not in a hypothetical world which may never exist in a future time which may never dawn. Simply living for the here and now. And I've met so many people that are not concerned with the future at all because they're like, hey, I'm not going to be here. So of course they're not concerned with what's going on today, or as society downward spirals, they have no concern because they can still get all the pleasure comforts they want while they're alive. And this is what individualism has brought to modern male. This is what capitalism has brought to modern male. This is what democracy has brought to modern male. This mentality. In consistence with this view of life, modern man has waged a relentless war against all which appeared to him to replace restrictions on his freedom, because only in an unfettered freedom does he believe it possible to realize his will to live. To let all this come to pass, he has made a slogan of the word liberty, which has become for him a truly magic word capable of unlocking the doors of heaven and on earth, and offering him what he has always sought and never found because it can never be found, viz-a material and sensual happiness. And you meet these people all the time. They get all dreamy-eyed and they talk about liberty, but they have no fucking clue what liberty is, what it means. It's an abstract concept. And like Mario is saying here, it's something that can never be found. You can never make yourself material and sensual happy enough. You're always going to want more. You'll never be satisfied with it. You look at all the rich, successful people that have killed themselves. You can't fill that void with material. You can't fill that void with pleasure senses. A direction in man, a purpose to life can fill that void. And fascism offers that where democracy cannot, where capitalism cannot. In the name of religious liberty, he has undermined religion. In the name of political liberty, he has nullified the state. In the name of economic liberty, he has enslaved his brethren. In the name of personal liberty, he has destroyed the family. A thoroughly materialistic view of human life has thus brought about the triumph of the individual's animalistic will to live over the individual's spiritual aspirations, and the downfall of those institutions which took mankind's eons of time to bring into being and represent the true achievements of man on this earth. All sense of responsibility has fled from that man. Responsibility towards the spirit within, calling him to make his outward actions the expression of an inward life. Responsibility towards his fellow beings who become the tool and the pawn of his selfish desires. and responsibility towards the state, which demands from its citizens new generations dedicated not to the pursuit of the ego's desires, but to the service of the fatherland's needs. A new dark age is still possible, and it will dawn upon us soon enough unless we find a meaning for life, a different purpose than the satisfaction of the senses, and finally a new goal for our efforts. It is the possibility of such a dark age which fascism is trying strenuously and successfully to stave off by teaching us anew the truth that we need to visualize and to worship a deeper reality lying behind and beyond the intermediate and closely bound world of the self, if we want to find peace, achieve salvation, and restore dignity and purpose to our life. The conduct of life cannot be left to the individual choice of the people, cannot be dependent from their individual likes and dislikes. It must be instead determined for them by a power which is above them and comprehends them, namely the state. Because upon the state rests the duty and the task of the fulfillment of the national ideal, because the state alone is conscious of the ends and the aims of the nation's life. This cardinal tenet of fascism, fully realized in practice as well as in theory, brings to a close the whole period of human history characterized by the belief in man and his powers. That period begun with the Reformation, leading to the French Revolution and the Declaration of Rights of Man, and ending finally with the present state of chaos and despair of the modern world. The conduct of life must rest upon three great unalterable principles. Fascism maintains, namely, the principle of unity, the principle of authority, and the principle of duty. The first principle of the fascist conduct of life rests upon a mystic belief of the oneness of all living beings. The second principle, the principle of authority, rests upon another mystic belief, that of the divine essence of the hero. Not the military hero, but the hero in the sense meant by Carlyle's hero of the soul. And Carlyle says, find in any country the ablest man that exists there. Raise him to the supreme place in loyalty. Reverence him. You have a perfect government for that country. No ballot box, parliamentary eloquence, voting, constitution building, or other machinery whatsoever can improve it a whit. It is the perfect state, the ideal country. Thus spoke Carlyle in his lecture on the hero as king, delivered the 22nd of May, 1840, and his words are no less true today than they were 100 years ago. Nay, still closer to the truth, if that could be possible, and true in a still deeper sense than Carlyle ever thought. And that's been shown all throughout history. When you have this avatar, I mean, they just completely change the whole game. They can lead a people to heights never thought obtainable. No man is an outcast in the social system of fascism. No man is worthless. No man, that is, who belongs to the fascist nation and to its life. And that is another frustrating aspect of being a fascist in this modern world, is that the people fascism would help the most damn it today. And they want to commit violence to you for being a fascist. So it's a grand irony and a little black pilling at times when you're met with so much resistance and ignorance towards the fascistic ideal, when no man is worthless in a fascist nation. That is the point of fascism. But today we see in the modern system, in the current system, not only are some men worthless, but many are expendable. It is therefore not the smallest title of glory of fascism to have brought about this new realization of the fellowship of man at a time held by common consent to be a time of supreme and inevitable moral decadence. Well, you should see it today, buddy. I mean, if he thought that was moral decadence in the 30s, yeah, he had no idea. Well, he had an idea. He was obviously fighting against what the future was going to be if fascism didn't win. But yeah, we got moral decadence cubed compared to what Mario Palomari was dealing with. But those two great principles of unity of all human beings and of devotion to authority as expressed through the scale of human values cannot be separated. Fascism holds from the third and greatest principle of all, the principle of duty. In this conception of duty as a supreme motive power of the actions of man, and in the belief that such a conception can be transformed into a living reality, that fascism reveals most clearly the profound idealism underlying its philosophy. Man is gifted with reason and is gifted with a social capacity. He has made so far full use of his first gift. In high time, fascism says, that he realizes all the possibilities contained within the second. Man, in other words, must be awakened to the sense of responsibility towards his fellow being, which is comprehended under the name of duty. And until this sense of responsibility is entirely awakened and active in his life, he is not entitled to the name of man. Think military brotherhood when he's talking here. Think of that bond that's built and brotherhood when, especially in battle. And he's saying citizens should manifest the strength of this bond, even without battle, but simply being citizens, being brothers, on the same path, on the same mission, battling the same struggle together as we advance together. In common with all the animal kingdom, man pursues his rights, but alone in the universe he is bound to recognize duty. Fascism rejects the doctrine of materialism and any other doctrine which attempts to explain the intricate history of human societies from the narrow and exclusive standpoint of the preeminence of material interests. Finally, when faced by the issue of relationship of man to his fellow beings, fascism rises to the vision of that future state of society, that state in which man shall not attempt to enslave his brethren, shall not erect himself as their master, but shall instead do whatever in his power to elevate them to a higher level of consciousness, where ethical norms reign supreme. The general, all-embracing conception is that life is an expression of the soul, and as such flowering at its best only when its spiritual claims are fully recognized and satisfied. Now, the nature of these claims is such that they conflict inevitably with all the individual's egotistical aspirations, ambitions, and desires. The fascist conception of life advances, therefore, demands upon the inner world of man that the ordinary human being is wary to satisfy. It is from this contrast between the claims of the individual and the claims of the whole that the problem of liberty arises, because fascism finds it necessary at the outset to take away from the ordinary human being what he has been taught and has grown to cherish the most, personal liberty. And it can be affirmed without falling into exaggeration that a curtailment of personal liberty not only has proved to be and must necessarily be a fundamental condition of the triumph of fascism. Unfortunately, it is due to such a curtailment that the greatest misunderstanding of fascism has risen in a world where personal liberty is made almost the paramount issue of life. But fascism holds that personal liberty is not an end to itself. Personal liberty is simply a means to the realization of a much greater end, namely the liberty of the spirit. This last meaning, the faculty of the human soul of rising above the power of outward circumstances and inward needs to devote itself to the cult of those ideals which form the true goal of life. And if you notice, this in the previous video was mentioned a lot in the video on the four bodies, of not simply just being a reaction to stimuli surrounding you, which unfortunately most people are. Two radical different conceptions of liberty are thus in conflict, and there is no hope that the abyss which separates them can never be bridged. So that is always the argument against liberty, or against fascism, is, it takes away liberty from us. No, fascists have a different conception of liberty than the conception of liberty of the modern male. In the fascist conception, to be free means to be no more a slave to one's own passions, ambitions, or desires. Means to be free to that will what is true and good and just at all times, in all cases. Means, in other words, to realize here in this world the true mission of man. In the individualistic conception, instead, to be free is to follow the call of one's own nature, to worship one's own God, to think, to act, or to speak according to the dictates of one's own mind, to earn, to spend, to save, or to hoard at will, to accumulate property and to deed it following one's own whims or fancy, to reach all hedonistic goals, wealth, happiness, or pleasure. In other words, to be unhindered by compulsions, restrictions, or prohibitions, rules, codes, and laws. In this conception, liberty takes, as Spangler says, liberation from all bonds of civilization, from every kind of form and custom, pride and quietly born poverty, silent fulfillment of duty, renunciation for the sake of a task or conviction, greatness in enduring one's fate, loyalty, honor, responsibility, achievements, all this a constant reproach to the humiliated and insulted. And even admitting that scientific progress and national economic planning were to make it possible for each and every individual to come in possession of a reasonable amount of material comfort, it still remains true that it is the very nature of man that he is not at any time satisfied with his present condition, and therefore his yearning to earn more, spend more, save more, accumulate more property will still and always gnaw at his heart and make him wish for that magic freedom which is not of this world, or at least not of the world in its civilized state. Truly freedom, absolute unrestricted freedom, is not the child of liberty, but the mother of anarchy. A true culture state means a state of society in which ethical values reign supreme, and ethical values presuppose in all cases limitations of individual freedom. Every human being, in fact, finds himself facing at the very instance of his life the dilemma whether the satisfaction of a certain desire, a certain instinct, or a certain need conflicts with the welfare of his fellow beings, and whether or not he ought to bring about the realization of such a satisfaction irrespective of its ultimate consequences. It is in the making of this decision, it is in the act of choosing not what he knows he desires, likes, or needs, but what his conscience tells him he ought to choose, even if this choice means suffering, disgrace, or martyrdom, or death, that a human being becomes worthy of the name of man. Then and only then he rises to the vision of the true role, the understanding of the true meaning, and the knowledge of the true function of liberty. Then and only then the words of Emile can appear to him full of significance. He can give the affirmative answer to the pregnant question of the Swiss thinker: is not responsibility the ultimate root of the being of man? It is high time instead, says fascism, that the individual be brought back to the vision of his true place in the universe. It is high time that he learns how to curb and master his self. The day that he has learned how to master his own destiny, that day will sign for man his title to freedom, complete, unbound freedom, and will mark thus for him the birth of his true manhood. Man must become, therefore, the master of his own self, master of his own fate. This is the call and the challenge of our times. This is the message of fascism, to rise above the power of the outward circumstances and the inward needs, to heed the call of the Spirit, to bring forth the divine in him, must be the true goal of man's efforts. Man must realize then, with fascism, that this freedom is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. In the words of Mussolini, liberty is not a right, but a duty. According to fascism, a true, great spiritual life cannot take place unless the state has risen to a position of preeminence in the world of man. The curtailment of liberty thus becomes justified at once with this need of raising the state to its rightful position. And that position is being the spearhead, guiding and creating this type of society, this type of environment where man's lower instincts are not fed upon, where man is not encouraged to indulge endlessly in his personal wants, but rather man becomes a part of a team, man becomes a part of the nation. Man now has a reason to work and live outside of himself. This is why fascism is not some mere political doctrine, but a way of life.